Welcome to the Rest is Politics Question Time with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell.
And Alastair, where would you like to start?
Why don't we start with Talia Sanchez? I'd like to hear your thoughts on a recent report predicting a post-pandemic spike in bad behaviour in schools due to homeschooling. Do you think we've all been too quick to brush off the guaranteed lasting impacts of such an unprecedented time, particularly for our children and young people? I went to a school recently where they had already noticed a really big rise in exclusions. And of course, there aren't that many places that excluded children can go to. And there does seem that, so this report did spell out that they think this is directly related to the impact of COVID. Did you take a look at that, Rory?
Yeah. So to give a sense of the country as a whole, so about 3.5% of pupils in the UK traditionally were suspended from school. But being suspended from school correlates with or goes along with a lot of other things that can be very worrying in terms of poverty, in terms of your life chances. So just over 3% excluded from school generally. But in prisons, we found often 35% of the prisoners have been excluded from school. So it's got a strong connection. Things go wrong. To be fair to teachers that do it, there's a lot of controversy about this. There are people who think schools are using exclusions much too much. But there are other teachers that you talk to who are just like, you simply don't understand that we don't want to exclude children from school, but occasionally you have a child who's completely disrupting the education for every other child in that classroom. And you sometimes have no choice. You've got to think about the other children. And if one person, as you can imagine, if one person's really kicking off at the back of the classroom, nobody else is going to pay any attention. They're just going to be looking at the child that's kicking off. So getting that balance right, working out how you deliver good education for those students who aren't at risk of expulsion while also looking after the children who get expelled is very tough.
Yeah. Well, my Fiona has been sort of chair of governors of various schools for yonks, and I know that they go to real lengths to try to avoid exclusions, and sometimes it's impossible. I think there are schools where, frankly, kids get excluded all too easily because they worry more about the results and the Ofsted than they do necessarily about the welfare of all the kids. But there is a rise. 50 English secondary schools have suspended more than a quarter of pupils after the pandemic. And that is much more likely to be happening in the poorest areas, 3 times more likely to be suspended as those in wealthier schools. So there's definitely a problem coming down the track here, and I think it's good to be aware of it.
Yeah, so a lot of this, Alistair, seems to be people who were at primary school age during COVID and therefore were effectively at home, not at school, and maybe didn't socialize, missed out on education for that critical period. And that seems to be really contributing to them struggling to reintegrate, is sort of polite way of putting it, or behavior difficulties when they're getting back.
Catherine T. Rory, how do I continue a relationship with my dad, who represents everything I struggle with in today's political climate? Brexit voter, Reform Party supporter, GB News watcher, and is everything I'm trying to fight against in today's political climate, who believes I'm woke and tells me that me and my wokeness is what's ruining the country. To maintain a relationship and not challenge him makes me a complicit bystander and makes me angry with myself, while challenging him like I have affects my mental health profoundly. Right, bit of advice here, Rory. That's tricky, that one.
That is tricky, and
That's tricky.
It goes to the heart of a lot of what we talked a lot about in Brexit, where at one point, I think almost half of Brexit voters and half of Remain voters wouldn't consider one of their children marrying someone from the other side. It's really tough. You have to somehow, as with any disagreement in a family, try to get back to what you actually really love and admire about people. I mean, I of course, in Cumbria, the majority of my voters voted for Brexit. Many of them would support reform. And yet I found many of those people who voted for Brexit remained close friends, were incredibly funny, practical, loyal. And that's true, I'm sure, is basically what Tim Walz is trying to say about Trump voters in the US. One thing she could do, though, as a short-term thing, is to share an article written by Will Lloyd called "The End of Woke Spells Trouble for the Right" in the Times yesterday, where he argues that actually, basically, the genius move of Kamala Harris and others is to basically give up on the woke rhetoric, leaving the right with nothing to complain about. Will Lloyd says that Kamala Harris's speech was largely noticeable for revealing the extraordinary power of American dentistry. So a typically sort of cheeky article from Will Lloyd that she might want to share with her father.
Yeah. You mentioned Tim Walls there. Somebody made this wonderful observation about him. The reason why Tim Walls is connecting with people so much is because he reminds everybody of what their dad used to be like before Fox News was invented. And they all started just shouting at televisions all the time. And I mean, the legacy of Fox News within the American political debate is pretty extreme. And Catherine there mentions the fact that her dad watches GB News. Now, not many people do, but those that do, I suspect, are being radicalized in the same way. And I guess all you can do, Catherine, is perhaps sit there and watch it, and without sort of saying he's daft to be watching it or daft to believing it, do point out when the things that are being said are untrue. Do point out the reasons why they're being said and just try to engage in the debate. But this is the thing that I talked to Frank Luntz and David Urban about, that I talked about on the main podcast yesterday, that I have definitely got myself into this position. Less so here, because I don't think I did have Boris derangement syndrome, as it was called, because I always felt that if enough people carried on telling the truth about him, eventually he'd be done, and he is done. Whereas with Trump, it goes much, much, much deeper. I genuinely find it hard to understand how anybody can vote for that guy. And it means it's difficult to have a conversation with somebody who does. But you've got to try to separate the person from that individual action. So in your dad's case, voting Brexit, supporting reform, watching GB News, you've got to divorce those facts from who that person is and try to get back to who that person is and bring that real person out of them. I hope that helps. We've morphed into agony answer, Rory.
Alistair, here's a really testing question coming in from Jess. What are we supposed to believe about Stakeknife, which, to remind people, was this very high level IRA head of internal security in the IRA during the troubles in Ireland, who turned out to be a British agent and who the British, certainly military and potentially the security service, allowed him to continue killing people so that they could continue getting information from him. And there's been accusations that the former head of the security service, Eliza Manning and Buller, had suggested that they didn't know about it. And then listeners had come in saying she did know about it. Over to you.
Well, Eliza Manning Buller, who we interviewed with John Soares, the former head of MI6, on Leading a few weeks ago, she is clearly a keen listener to the podcast, has followed the various discussions we've had, and she actually sent us this message. I'm going to read it because it's quite interesting, and I think Paul O'Connor at the Finucane Centre will be interested in this because it sort of continues the conversation. She says, I did not have knowledge of the agent known as Stakeknife, who was run by the army when he was in place. This was in line with need-to-know principles. It's now clear to me that MI5 had some limited knowledge earlier than I had previously understood. As has been made clear previously, MI5 was not responsible for how Stakeknife was recruited and run as an agent. I'd also like to point out that it was not until October 2007, after I retired, that MI5, for the first time in its history, was given the lead intelligence responsibility in Northern Ireland. So we did not have absolute authority. I think that's a reference to the discussion that you and I had, and our rules were not necessarily followed by others. So I don't know what you make of that, whether that clears things up or actually just makes them even more interesting.
I think we should keep this rolling. Maybe a final question from you, Alistair.
Andy wants to know, Rory, if you had to pick someone else to replace the other person on the podcast, who would it be and why? Serious answers only.
Serious answers only? Bollocks.
In other words, not a joke. I don't want Eric Morecambe or, whatever.
So you suddenly get so fed up with Burnley's poor performance that you head off to the Maldives, and I have to think about who to get in instead.
Yeah. No, I could do the podcast. No, Rory, I suspect that Andy is kind of, imagining our deaths.
You're kind of imagining the deaths. That's treasonous. Okay, so Alistair.
I'm not the king.
Well, the problem is that all the obvious alternatives have already been tried by other of our less successful competitors.
That's not entirely true. I mean, David Gork stood in for you when you were on your retreat. I thought he was very, very good.
David Gork, he's very good. Yeah, there's David Gork. You try Kwasi Kwarteng. He did pretty well on our leading interview, didn't he? I'd be very happy to do one with Angela Rayner.
Oh, you and Angela Rayner would be good.
There we are.
Okay. I had dinner last night with Anna Sawa. I think you and Anna Sawa would be quite good.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. We need a bit of grit in the oyster, wouldn't we? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there aren't that many Tories to pick from for me these days, are there?
No, very, very, very few left.
Ken Clark would have been good back in the day. I think we'd go so we're going David Gork and Angela Rayner. How's
Lovely.
about that?
So beautiful. Beautiful. Let's end on that. And Alastair, have a great day today. I think you're running for a train, and thanks for doing Question Time with us.
See you soon. Bye.